Can American conservatives unite to fight against a surge of anti-Semitism? That's an open question, as many on the right seem to think that asking people to disassociate themselves from Israel bashers like Tucker Carlson, or even more extreme conspiracy mongers like Candace Owens, or even the neo-Nazi groypers, is worse than the vile hatred they are spewing. Is a movement that thinks there can be no enemies on the right, even when they are anti-Semites, vulnerable to being hijacked by them and their apologists and enablers. Next, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into this controversy and how it threw the prestigious Heritage Foundation think tank into chaos, with Victoria Coates, a scholar who has been at the forefront of the controversy, and find out what's next in the battle against anti-Semitism. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with the Heritage Foundation's Victoria Coates about the troubling rise of anti-Semitism on the political right. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, a programming note. We'll be off next week, but we'll be back 2 weeks from now with a special Ask Me Anything episode, in which I'll answer viewer and listener questions about just about anything. Please send in your questions to thinktwice@jns.org, and I'll get to as many as I can. And now to today's program. Can a conservative movement that includes Tucker Carlson be part of a battle against a rising tide of anti-Semitism sweeping the globe? Since leaving Fox News, Carlson has thrown off all restraints and now will platform anyone who will bash Israel and the Jews, even Holocaust deniers, neo-Nazis, and those on the far left. But his close ties to the conservative and Republican establishment made headlines in recent months when he hosted groyper Nick Fuentes for a chummy interview on his popular podcast. The refusal of some prominent figures on the right to disassociate themselves from Carlson after that created a firestorm of controversy that engulfed, among other places, the conservative think tank the Heritage Foundation, which ironically has been at the forefront, on the front lines fighting anti-Semitism, including inspiring President Trump's efforts to fight it at elite universities. Yet the head of Heritage initially released an appalling video saying that he would never disavow Carlson and claiming that a venomous coalition was attacking him. He since apologized and walked back that response, but with the controversy going on, many supporters of Israel and leading conservatives are leaving Heritage. But today we have the opportunity to get to the bottom of this story with someone who is both a leader in the fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, as well as a major figure at Heritage, and we're pleased to have her with us today to discuss it. Victoria Coates is the vice president of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Her writing has appeared in outlets including Bloomberg, the New York Post, and the Wall Street Journal. She served in a number of roles in the first Trump administration as the senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Energy and deputy national security advisor for the Middle East and North Africa for President Trump. In addition, her work on policy, she's a distinguished art historian and is the author of David Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art. And she's also the author of the 2024 The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. Victoria Coates, welcome back to Think Twice.
Jonathan, great to be with you.
Well, Victoria, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you the question a lot of people have been asking in the last few months. What's happened at the Heritage Foundation? How was it possible for the Washington institution that has really been at the forefront of the battle against anti-Semitism and I think been responsible for some of the most important progress made in that fight in the last year, become embroiled in a controversy in which its leader, Kevin Roberts, seemed to have difficulty choosing between ties with Tucker Carlson and the need to focus on the issues on which it's played such an important leadership role.
Well, thank you for that question, Jonathan. And just from my perspective, I agree with you that heritage has been at the forefront in the American fight against antisemitism, which is why I published a letter in the Wall Street Journal to that effect, which was look at Dr. Roberts' record. What we've done over the last 2.5 years that I've been the vice president of the Davis Institute, no one else is doing this work. And we could not do it without his support and then his direct participation. And so leaving the controversy aside, I just wanted that record to be out there in a dispassionate way, because that is the Kevin Roberts that I know. And so I think you can look at a confluence of very unfortunate events since our internal Heritage Town Hall meeting was leaked. Everybody can read or watch it rather online.
Indeed, everybody did.
And everybody did. Yeah. We knew that might happen, but that wasn't why we did the meeting. However, you can hear Dr. Roberts in his own words go through what went down on that Thursday when that video was released. Now, I will say I couldn't stop it. I disagreed with the content of it. I felt it was, if he was determined to do it, it was his right as the president of Heritage. But I think if we could all go back, we would have things evolve differently. But that being said, Jonathan, I think what's critically important about this moment is it exposed the problem we have on the right. And I think a lot of us who have known Tucker Carlson for a number of years, full disclosure, we went to Trinity together. I date myself, but I was a year ahead of him. I was class of 90. He was class of 91. Further dating myself. This is terrible. But I think, for those of us who have known him, what he is doing now is difficult to comprehend. And, you don't want to see that happen to someone. And so I think, but what that episode at Heritage exposed is even one of our great institutions could run afoul of this. And what Dr. Roberts pledged to do in the second video he put out, and what I know is his plan in 2026 is to make Heritage a leader in examining this problem and trying to figure out how we deal with it, keeping together a coalition that can continue to win elections, because the bigger monster, which we saw on Bondi Beach in Australia this week, that's the worst monster, which is the Islamicist, aggressively anti-Semitic, just wanting to kill Jews. They don't care if they're in Australia or in the kibbutz in southern Israel. They just want to kill. That's what we have to get over, but we have to take care of ourselves first.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it is important that we address this. And I think a lot of the discussion about Kevin Roberts seemed to ignore, the fact that he was responsible in large measure for Heritage becoming involved in the fight of anti-Semitism, against it in a way that, really nobody else was doing. I mean, but I guess that still raises the question, how did it happen that his initial reaction was, Tucker right or wrong? And I guess really the follow-up for me, which was something that I learned only after this unfolded, was that Heritage was one of the sponsors of the Tucker Carlson network until last June, around the time that he was attacking the administration's Iran policy. But how did that relationship happen, and why did it survive Carlson's platforming of Darryl Cooper, this faux historian and Holocaust denier, which was a big blow up several months earlier?
Now, that's a perfectly legitimate question. The relationship with Tucker is longstanding. He got, I believe, his first, if not his second job at Heritage. And as I said, has been well known to a number of us, including Dr. Roberts, through the years.
Sure.
And it's not my business to tell you who our media contracts are with. It would maybe surprise you the number of people that we do work with on this, on getting our message out, promoting our policies, which is a necessity in this modern age.
Sure.
And for a long time, the relationship with Tucker was quite productive, because he's reaching a key demographic that I think we have to reach, which primarily, not exclusively, but is primarily young men, 20 to 30, rough age bracket. And so for us, knowing the core of our work, knowing what we were promoting for a period of time, that was a valuable relationship. But as you said, when the contract was up in June, it was largely business decision that we were not going to renew it. And so, we didn't want to call any when you let a contract lapse, it doesn't seem to us, like something for a press release. So, we didn't say anything publicly about it and just went about, our business. That became kind of a cause because there were some residual references to Tucker on our website, which personally I didn't know about, but also you'll be pleased to learn taking care of the Heritage website is not part of my duties.
I understand that. Yeah.
But there were these residual references which were made much of, after the Nick Fuentes interview, which Dr. Roberts has condemned in the strongest terms. And I think anybody who listens to that interview, especially as a Ted Cruz alum, that was beyond the pale. And, as much as I defend free speech, Tucker can have his views and he can voice them. And I agree with Dr. Roberts. I don't want this to be personal. I don't want people to be canceled. I don't really understand that. That, again, maybe age. I think it's also pretty much impossible to cancel anybody in 2025. There's so many different platforms. So, from my perspective, Tucker has his views. I have mine. We clearly strongly disagree on these things. But, I don't want this to become a situation filled with personal animus. And I think, Dr. Roberts' intent was to, say that sometimes friendship can endure these disagreements and to try to reach that demographic I described. He puts this in his own words in the town hall. So I'd really urge people to listen to what he says rather than my interpretation of it. But the fact that it could happen here and did happen here is, again, I think, an important exposure of a bad problem, which, I don't think anyone can deny.
Yeah, well, I guess the question that leaves me asking is, what is the state of sort of the conservative mindset right now? The Heritage Town Hall that was held after the Carlson blow-up, I clearly was intended to calm the waters, though after it became public, what was said there seemed to inflame the controversy. As I said, everybody saw it. The question I want to ask about is, are young conservatives in Washington as open to being influenced by the groypers and Fuentes, let alone Tucker and Candace Owens, as so many people are saying? I mean, Rod Dreher, someone I guess we probably both know or know of, wrote about being told that when he visited Washington recently that 30 to 40% of young Republicans working in the Capitol are fans of Fuentes. I mean, even if that number were only half that, and I don't know what the number is or how you'd measure it, what do you think is happening, causing so many people, especially on the younger people, to drift towards the anti-Semitic right? And can American conservatism survive a shift towards tolerance of these extremists, especially at a time when the left and the Democratic Party seems to have already surrendered to left-wing anti-Semites who are now increasingly being mainstreamed and normalized?
No, this is the crux of our dilemma, and again, why exposure of it is so important. And I don't know where Rod got that number. I mean, I've been told it's higher.
Wow. Okay.
But again, I don't know how you measure it.
Sure.
But certainly it is a strong undercurrent that is real. And so I think we have to go back and look at the experience of that demographic. A lot of them were shaped by the 2008-2009 financial crisis and by a lot of loss and sort of displacement in their early youth, which I think they felt was kind of a grievance for them, for want of a better word. And then this was the generation that was graduating from high school during COVID, and they lost a lot. Some of them lost 2 years of social interaction, retreated entirely onto online platforms. That was their means of socialization. A lot of them then, when they came out of COVID, weren't quite sure, how do you ask a girl out? They still do that these days. Or, how do you interact intellectually? And it is a lot easier, as all of us now know, to kind of retreat behind a Zoom and not engage in good faith discussions and to demonize our opposition. And a lot of what happened to, say, Charlie Kirk, with that young man who had retreated into a world of video games and fantasy. Charlie, for him, wasn't a human being. The human being we all knew, many of us loved him. But I mean, he was a human like anybody else, and he wanted to debate people personally, directly. But for that young man in particular, he became a thing, an it. And he's an enemy in a video game that deserves to die. And so I think you have a lot of these folks consuming a lot of information, particularly on TikTok. We've done a tremendous amount of work on this at Heritage, where it is very heavily skewed, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, particularly. And they're getting this just constantly. And on top of that, another thing we've been working on is the sort of infiltration of these views into official public K through 12 education in the United States, which is a real problem. So even if you're coming from a household that is pro-Israel, disagrees with anti-Semitism, would never consider yourself anti-Semitism, all day in your classroom, you're getting this kind of soft, repeated questioning of Israel, questioning of the Jewish people, denial of the Judeo-Christian values of the founders. I think it was interesting. Elon Musk was talking about this on a recent broadcast when he said he was asking a friend's kid, what she learned about George Washington, and all he got back was he was a slaveholder. And that was literally all this affluent, upper-class student at a very good high school could tell about George Washington. And so that's what they've been educated on. And I think that is what has created the vulnerability. And as with so many things that were exposed about our education system during COVID, it is beholden on us to get after this.
Yeah, well, it's a frightening situation, and I think you've described it pretty well. I want to drill down, though, on something you noted in your previous answer. And at the heart of this sort of mini civil war on the right is the notion that gatekeeping, quote unquote, to keep out extremists is worse even than the extremism or even anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that is trying to be gatekeeped. I think we should all understand that the left's intolerance against dissent, against their woke catechism and their other, intersectional myths, has fueled a backlash on the right that gave gatekeeping a bad name. But how is it possible to have a coherent conservative movement without boundaries? Wasn't that one of William Buckley's great accomplishments as he built the modern American conservative movement? Why is it that we're now asked to basically accept anyone when we know that really nobody really does that? Everybody draws lines. The question is, where are you going to draw those lines?
No, that I think is the most important question for us going into 2026 and then 2028 is, where are those lines? What is the difference between somebody who wants to have, a policy conversation with me about U.S.-Israel policy, and and that keeps being couched as, is that anti-Semitic? Of course not. There are 9-10 million citizens of Israel who question their government every single day, Jonathan.
Yes, just as 335 million Americans get up every day and criticize their government.
Exactly. And that doesn't make them anti-Semites. And I think that's such a straw man. And so, for me, having conversations about U.S.-Israel policy, that's what I do for a living. I enjoy that. I'm never going to get upset with an American citizen for asking me questions about a policy, as long as they'll at least listen to my answer. They don't have to agree with me. If they'll listen and engage, of course, we welcome those conversations. But that's a long way from a lot of the things that are being repeatedly said, not just by Nick Fuentes, but others in this world, which is that Jews are malignant, that they are trying to control America and the world, and they have no evidence of this, largely because it's not true, but also because they're not required to actually document it. You mentioned some of the other kind of faux historians. As a historian myself, I find that pretty offensive, that you have people coming along and just deciding they're going to make up whatever historical facts they want based on largely coincidences, if they even have that, and then coming on as if there's some great alternative voice because they have no actual basis in real history, which, as we know, is very difficult because you're trying to piece together the best possible version of past events with an imperfect record. And so you have to be extremely rigorous about that record, what you do have, if you're going to write persuasive history. So I think that's part of the danger that we face here, and making sure that, when we have disagreements, as civilly as we can, to say, look, I disagree with that. Here's my evidence. What do you think?
Hmm. Well, let me go back to Carlson, because you're right. Obviously, we can have a vigorous policy debate. We have them within the Jewish community about Israel. We have them among Zionists. But the question is, as much as one might not want it to be about personalities, and I know Tucker has lots of friends, people he knows. It's Washington is a small company town in some ways, and he's been around for a long time. But how does the conservative movement function with such a prominent person? I mean, because he really is prominent. He's got a big following, seems to still be a member of the inner circle in the Trump family, close to the vice president, who is not merely, just asking questions, as he disingenuously claims, but is now basically at war with the whole idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage, and is willing to platform anyone, wherever they are on the political spectrum or religious spectrum, who will say something horrible about Israel, including, just the worst figures from the UN or the far left. How does conservatism function when someone who's basically at war with the Jews in Israel is still kind of part of the Republican establishment?
Well, I think that is what is changing, and what has to change, and to have the experience we had at Heritage be the catalyst behind that. I didn't enjoy it. I wish it hadn't happened. I'm not saying that it was inherently a good thing, but I think it is what is forcing people to make choices and to say, okay, there are views that are I find so discredited. And, for me personally, given my background, with the thing that troubles me the most is the platforming of folks who are denying that there's a Christian genocide going on in Nigeria.
Yeah, right. Forget about Israel. Yeah. That's his new cause, because somehow he associates that with, sort of being against supporters of Israel, I suppose.
Right. I mean, no, but I mean, and not to diminish any of that. I can't explain it. But just for me personally, that shows that this isn't just about the Jews in Israel. This is a broader set of positions that are deeply troubling. And so, I think we do need to come to terms with what that is, what the role of these views are, what is, the line between a Nick Fuentes, because it's easy to say that Fuentes and Kevin Roberts did this very explicitly, to say that these views are just so bizarre, extreme, and unfounded, that is easy to condemn. What you're pointing to is something that's much harder, with somebody who is well known, as I said, many of us, and has been a friend and has been a political supporter. You mentioned the vice president, and that was a key relationship for them. So, that is, I don't, unfortunately, I wish there was an easy answer, and I could tell you that saying this is good, saying this is bad, and we have these bright goalposts. But, that doesn't really exist right now, but that doesn't mean we can't grapple with it and try to establish those goalposts for the broadest possible coalition of conservatives that we can put together, because that's the only thing that's going to actually win us elections.
Yeah, well, I agree with you there. And, the truth is, when Bill Buckley was doing this in the 1960s, and then again, with the John Birch Society, and then again in 1990, with antisemitism when he took it on, I mean, nobody is in the position that Bill Buckley is in today, just because the media is so much more diverse, our culture is so much diverse because since Al Gore invented the internet. And yet, I think certainly President Trump and Vice President Vance, or if anyone is situated to sort of draw some lines, they can. People like us can't, but they could. Is it too much to ask them to do something about that, or is this just something that has to evolve?
No, and then we can obviously make recommendations, and I think the president and the vice president are going to speak for themselves. I think the president's record in particular is crystal clear on this issue. I mean, he has been the most pro-Israel, pro-Jewish president in my lifetime. And not that I'm calling anybody else anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, but he has been overtly supportive. And you go back to his first AIPAC speech, and I believe it was during the 2016 primary, and he did a couple of things that were unexpected. He didn't mouth the traditional, okay, two-state solution, blah. He went right after the Iranians and said he was going to make, the campaign promise to move the embassy to Jerusalem, and he made good on that in his first year in office. I believe the announcement was December 6, 2017. I remember that day because it was a great day. And, the move then 6 months later, he followed up. He did what he said he was going to do. And so I think his personal views and his policies are very, very clear. And, he has, called Tucker kooky. So it's not as if, he's been unrelentingly supportive. So I think that's the example I would look towards. And, as this issue becomes more and more pronounced, I think you will see pressure on the administration to make, to set those clear guidelines. Again, they're going to do that in their own way, in their own time, as they should. But I do think that this is increasingly something we can't ignore.
Yeah, well, I just think, I mean, if, Tucker can't ever again have a speaking slot at the Republican National Convention if Republicans want to be serious about anti-Semitism. But let me ask you about sort of how this is shaken out and the position it's put you in. You are among the leaders of the National Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism that was basically housed within Heritage, but then decided to move its efforts outside of Heritage after this whole blow-up. You're still working at Heritage and supporting it and speaking for it at a time when it appears that, a number of other scholars, as well as donors reportedly, have left it over the blow-up over Tucker. Why are you staying? And do you believe it's possible for Heritage to continue to be a force against anti-Semitism if there were any doubt about where the institution, what it feels about Carlson and those he platforms, if that's unclear?
No, I mean, and that's precisely why, I remain in my position at Happy Warrior and eager to go forward with the work I detailed in the Wall Street Journal letter. That for me is the key thing, is if Heritage can continue to do this work. And, as you and I have discussed, we have our Project Esther, which is designed to combat anti-Semitism on the left, which I continue to point out is the bigger monster here. And so that's something I very much want to continue. And, Kevin Roberts' leadership has been great for Heritage. I think he has been a real voice for modern conservatives. And we have a good friend who's a strong leader who makes an error, and he has said it was an error, and then commits to make it right. And I feel like if I can help him do that, and in assisting in that process, I can help get rid of, what is a bad, noxious problem in the conservative movement. That is the best possible use of my time. And so for me, that was, it wasn't even really a call. It was, I want to make this right. I want to figure out a way we can use, a very bad thing that happened to us for the greater good. I'm very confident in that decision. I am excited about what we have planned for 2026. Going forward, we're revealing our 4 new cornerstones for our heritage policy. Again, I don't want to get ahead of that, but I think we really have the opportunity to modernize the institution, make it even stronger than it was before. And, clarity on these issues is something, as you said, it's hard. This is a difficult problem. I'm not saying we're 100% cooked yet, but getting to clarity on these issues will be central to that effort.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask one more question about this whole thing. And that is about Kevin Roberts, who, whether he wanted it or not, and clearly he didn't, became the focus of this even more in some ways, as much as, Tucker or Fuentes. You work with him personally, you know him in a way that obviously our audience does not. Sort of the initial explanations for that awful video that got posted struck a lot of people as like, they didn't get it. And even the excuses didn't seem to make any sense. Does he get it? why this was so offensive and why it was, basically, a deal breaker, even for some people who did leave heritage. And how committed is he to being on the right side of this issue, and to not being more focused on like no gatekeeping and, I won't cut off from my friends, even if they're doing terrible things.
As I said before, I don't want to speak for Dr. Roberts. I'll just say that from my perspective, yes, he does get it. I'll use one example, which I understand entirely, which is, the use of the term globalist. I know is in many circles interpreted as, the global conspiracy of Jews to control the world. When Dr. Roberts thinks about that, he thinks about when he went to Davos 2 years ago and in that very famous exchange called out the real globalists, who are the Davos people. And, that was for him in many ways an identifying moment for how he feels, particularly about European elites and their desire to control the sort of forgotten man and woman, if you will, through their climate policies, their fiscal policies, you name any part of that extremely odious sort of world approach. That's what he means by that word. So for him, it was surprising to say, gee, people thought I meant that, when for me it is so clear, from my history, this is what I mean by globalist. He did not understand before. I think he does understand now, and I think he is personally committed to making this right.
Yeah, I just want to interject. I mean, I use the term globalist.
I do all the time.
Yes, if anybody who reads my work or, follows my podcast know that, I talk about the same thing and the same problem, which is, quite frankly, at the heart of the sort of left-wing anti-Semitic threat that we need to deal with. For me, it wasn't so much him saying globalist. Of course, he should be talking about globalists.
That's just an example. Yeah.
Question is this idea of a venomous coalition who is against Carlson. That struck me as crazy.
I think that was a very problematic phrase as well. I can speak to that, to the globalist example as something that was very highly criticized, which was not at all what he was thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask about the Esther Project, which you are a part of, which was, I think, undoubtedly the inspiration for President Trump's effort to rid American higher education of anti-Semitism. How do you think that fight is going? That's those policies which we were only talking about in principle a year ago, but are now trying to be implemented. Can it succeed in the long run? And I guess the question I have about that I'd like your opinion, is that if there is no infrastructure within the government, whether it was at the Department of Education that Trump and most Republicans want to eliminate or somewhere else, can it be that even those schools that have made settlements with the government and promised to end their enabling intolerance for anti-Semitism to ensure that these institutions don't backslide? I mean, how is this going to work going forward, do you think?
Now, I think it's going to have to work on a couple of different levels. And important to just note that Project Esther is entirely a Heritage Foundation housed at the Davis Institute, which I lead, but also including our education groups, our legal groups, our domestic policy groups all participate in that. So that is entirely a heritage thing. The National Anti-Semitism Task Force was supportive of Esther, but they were never the implementers of it. And so that's a distinction I think most people don't understand. So Esther is part of our goals for 2026 as Davis, and one of its we're going to be particularly interested in precisely that policing that you're talking about, in providing as much support as we can to watch the implementation of these deals between institutions of higher education and the government, what's actually being done. And no, nobody in the executive branch has time to be running around to 1,000 different colleges and universities and looking at that. So that is an area where we can assist. And then going forward, I think the key institutions for this are going to be the State Department, which houses the anti-Semitism envoy, the Department of Justice, which also has an anti-Semitism group, but then it also has to come from the White House. And one of the things that I've proposed that my friend, who I know is also your friend, Eli Kohanem, came up with is the idea that you create a White House figure who is both the State Department's anti-Semitism envoy, a position that generally deals with international anti-Semitism, but then is double-hatted on the domestic council as somebody who works on domestic anti-Semitism, that you bring bring those two things together and have one powerful person who's managing both of those portfolios, put some real oomph behind it, and see if that can make a real difference. And in general, I'm a fan of, you start these things at the White House, you put the presidential authority and gravitas behind it, get it going, and then figure out which department and agency. And as you noted, we're going to see some real changes. I think we will see the abolition of the Department of Education by the end of President Trump's term. I know Secretary McMahon is deeply committed to it. We have some wonderful former staffers who are over there with her working on it. It has been, a real problem since establishment, I believe, in 1979. I don't think we can look at K through 12 education as any way materially improving during that period. And we've also seen a real devolution of our higher education institutions. So it has manifestly failed. But where those necessary capabilities and authorities go, I don't know that we've answered that yet. There are arguments to be made for various different institutions, but figure out what that home is, establish the right offices and authorities, which is critically important, and have the work done from there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think Ellie Cohen's idea is very good. We saw this in the last administration when we had a very prominent, respected anti-Semitism envoy in the form of historian Deborah Lipstadt, who, would speak about anti-Semitism abroad, but was silent about anti-Semitism at home at a time when it was really in crisis. And then only after she left office admitted that was a failure, which, thanks a lot. That has to change. Clearly, there has to be something more than, just it can't end with these agreements with these schools, because then they will just backslide, won't they?
No, absolutely. And it's not limited to the schools. The schools have been the flashpoint for it, but there are others, not non-governmental organizations. You go down the list, all sorts of other institutions that need to be watched, held accountable. And if they're promoting, speech that leads to violence, that isn't free speech. If you are inciting violence, that runs counter to our laws. If you are supplying material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization, such as Hamas, through your activities, whoever is funding you, that runs counter to our laws. That's not free speech.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, I'm looking abroad. You wrote in your book that came out last year that the Palestinians, as you said to me when you were here, need to get the message that they have to end their century-long war against Zionism and the existence of Israel. But I think the question of the moment, in the aftermath of the agreement to at least temporarily end the war that started on October 7th, is that if Hamas is allowed to stay in power, even in only part of Gaza, as is the current situation since the ceasefire and hostage release deal that was brokered by the administration, won't the message be that the world is prepared to stand by and wait before they start the next war, and that all this pro-Hamas propaganda around the world is actually, succeeding?
Well, that is, I think, what the problem that we've seen in Australia, for example, is where you have a government that, even after they had to expel the Iranian ambassador in August because the IRGC was running around Australia paying Eastern European thugs to foment the 1,600 examples of anti-Semitism that have occurred in Australia since October 7th, 2023. Even after that, you have the Prime Minister of Australia coming out and recognizing a Palestinian state. What does that do? That tells Hamas what you did on October 7th was legitimate. That was a tool to get to your political end, and we think it worked. And so we and the French and the Canadians and a whole bunch of people who shouldn't have known better are going to recognize this Palestinian state. And what do we get? We get Hamas encouraged to hang on because they think that's what they're being told, and they're not necessarily wrong. So, I do know that the driving force, because the president's been talking about this since this time last year, was to get those remaining hostages out. And absolutely to his credit, I believe we have the last one, and I was in Israel last week. It is so moving to walk down that ramp at Ben Gurion and have one little picture left. And you remember being there when both sides of the ramp were lined with the hostages' images, and to be down to one and hopefully have him come home, first one in, last one out, will be, a great moment. And that is extremely necessary. That had to happen. Now, if the Palestinians would like to have a better life, if they would like this to become a better situation for them, whether it be in Gaza or Judea and Samaria, wherever they're going to be, that is a question for them. And I think in Israel, if Hamas refuses to meet these benchmarks, I think Israel has every right to go to all of those countries that signed on to the president's plan and say, okay, we've moved on to step 2. We're ready to do X, Y, and Z. We have, the ceasefire is fragile, but it's holding. What are you guys going to do? Because this is your problem, to force them to disarm. And if you can't do that, diplomatically or through whatever means, then we have to go back in. I think that'll be the conversation. It's going to be a tough one, but this is on Hamas. It's not on Israel.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And of course, I don't think anybody seriously believes that the countries that have supported, the ceasefire and claim that they're going to do something in Gaza are willing to disarm Hamas. I think they'll be happy to go in and just be a presence. Everyone knows that the only force that can disarm Hamas is Israel. So that's a question what the president is going to decide about that, because of course he values the ceasefire. It was a great triumph. It was a great triumph for his diplomacy, especially the hostage releases. But if the ceasefire has to go in order to get rid of Hamas, I guess the question is he going to do that? It's hard for any of us, you or me, to know the answer to that question. But that is the key question, isn't it?
It is. And he has said, that if Hamas breaks the deal, then he is behind Israel 100%. And certainly his track record over the first term and over these 10 months now would bear that out. So I expect he would be supportive.
Yeah. Now, I think part of the debate in Washington about Israel has now become also one about Qatar. Its enormous influence operation in the United States has won some real successes, including the creation of a faction I've taken to calling the Qatar First Republicans, who are doing what they falsely accuse supporters of Israel of doing, and obviously Tucker is one of them. How can the administration sanction, as it is proposing to do, the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, while at the same time maintaining very close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood's main funder, host, and sponsor, the Emirate of Qatar? How can that play out in a way that provides a coherent answer, both about the conflicts in the Middle East and about anti-Semitism abroad, when Qatar is sort of subsidizing that?
Now, this is going to be a big challenge. And I think, our experience in the first term when we had the so-called Gulf Rift in June of 2017 with, UAE and Saudi and their allies essentially boycotting and blockading Qatar, the president was very clear to us at that point. He said, we need all of our partners and allies in the Gulf. And, there are a number of things that make Qatar an interesting country in terms of both its wealth, as you point out, which is historic for the number of people it supports, and then their natural gas potential. They will be, I believe, the largest exporter by the end of this decade, unless we get our act together. But in that case, they'd be the second largest. So, that are two very interesting characteristics, unique characteristics, which make them, I think, interesting to President Trump. And he has, made that clear. And the trip, I think, in May was important from this standpoint. As with the first trip in the first term, his first stop was Riyadh. Clearly Saudi Arabia is a key partner for him. He understands that relationship granularly and wants to emphasize that it is a major ally to the United States. But then he went on to Doha. He went to Qatar, and then he went on to Abu Dhabi. Message is the same. I need all of them. And, that has been his consistent policy, and he has been able to bring those countries together. We got to the end of the rift at the end of the first term. We have now cooperation between them. They were all sitting behind him in Sharm el-Sheikh. So, I'm one of these people who, sees we don't have a perfect ally. And those who say that they have found them and, have found the perfect ally and they've solved the controversies around the Gulf, I generally find her on a payroll, and so, but and Qatar does have a big payroll, but they are far from the only ones with the payroll. So my other issue with defining Qatar as the root of all evil is it takes your eye off the ball of what actually is in the Middle East, in my perspective, which is Iran. So I would like to focus on the Iranians. I would like to encourage our partners and allies who want to be closer to us to, improve some aspects of their activities. And I think that can potentially be productive. Not saying anyone's perfect or anyone isn't, but in that case, I do agree with President Trump that we do need all of our partners and allies in the region.
Okay. That's a reasonable argument. But how do we wind up sanctioning or designating the Muslim Brotherhood, which, is a force behind, terrorism and anti-Semitism around the world, when Qatar is obviously still closely tied to it? Yes, it's not a question of them not being perfect, but that's a specific holdup that I'm not sure how that conflict can be resolved.
It's why the Muslim Brotherhood issue is so complicated. And I've been working on this for more than a decade, in Senator Cruz's office in the first term and now subsequently. And we've taken a lot of different runs at it. And it's one of the reasons the Brotherhood is so effective is they are so dispersed. And it's very hard to define precisely what it is. That's why, what is the legal definition of the Muslim Brotherhood? That's why the FTO has been so complicated. Another one that we worked on that analogous but was equally thorny was the IRGC. And when you're going to designate an official element in a foreign military, what does that look like? How do you get the criterion of the FTO, which are quite specific, to match that? And so I think that's been a problem. It is a problem for Qatar. It is a problem for Turkey. It's a problem for a couple of other countries that have these associations. And again, I think the burden is on us to say, okay, this is what we're doing. This is what it means for you. And this is what you're going to have to disassociate yourself from if you don't want to run afoul of this designation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think we've all been reeling, and you mentioned it earlier, at the news of the Hanukkah massacre of Jews in Australia.
Yeah.
Which is just the latest instance of how anti-Israel blood libels and incitement led to violence. Yet we know that much of the media and left-wing politicians, such as the mayor-elect of New York City, continue to spread these lies. The question is, are leaders on the right, including President Trump and Vice President Pence, doing enough to combat this? What do you want to see them doing going forward on these issues?
No, it is really quite shocking. Exposes a number of things, Jonathan. And one thing that caught my attention is I don't know this, but it looks to me from their timelines that this would have been an immigrant who came to Australia after 9/11. And if you recall, there were a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle who were bending over backwards to be accommodating to Muslims who wanted to immigrate because they didn't want to be called Islamophobic. And so this guy was let in and then had his child in Australia. The younger man was a full Australian citizen. And they grew up, and that child grew up without assimilating into Australian society at all. And the fact that they would pick Bondi Beach, I mean, literally the emblem of the laid-back Australian culture, which is so reminiscent of Tel Aviv, and that they would pick that as the place to go and attack Jews on a random night in December that happened to be the first night of Hanukkah. What was festering in that household for those 30 years, bringing that young man up to be so embroiled in hatred of Jews. But I would just add, like the terrorists on October 7th, they didn't ask for anybody's passport. And the hero who disarmed the father was a Muslim.
Right.
They didn't say, oh, you're a Muslim, we're not going to shoot at you. They shot at him and they hit him a couple of times. And he was the one who was actually able to disarm one of them. And so, they don't care. They just want to kill, the friends of Jews, the friends of Australia. They want to undermine this country that's been so supportive of them. We have to take that seriously and look at the statements of our politicians that are creating that similarly permissive environment. And New York is going to be the most terrifying example. And what Mamdani does when he gets in, what he's capable of doing, can he renounce this stuff so that it's not like open season on Jews in New York City. That is a horrifying prospect for, I think, all reasonable Americans. And that's why what happened in Australia is an issue that I think commands the attention of the American people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's an important note for us to end on. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us today. How can our audience find out more about what Heritage is doing on these issues and follow your work?
Well, it is always a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm just back from Israel, as I said, where one of the reasons to go is to have this discussion. I want to be very clear as much as I can on where Heritage stands. So you find us at heritage.org. If you search Victoria Coates under that, you get all of my publications, a lot of my media appearances, and then you can follow me on X at Victoria Coates. You will have to endure some Philadelphia sports fanery, which I know is not everybody's cup of tea, but I feel very passionately about it, so I will not be silent on this issue.
Okay. That could be a whole separate podcast for us to discuss that. But
Absolutely.
anyway, thank you. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, where you can hear wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're listening to us there or on any one of them, or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And also a reminder, we'll be off next week, but we'll be back 2 weeks from now with a special Ask Me Anything episode in which I'll answer viewer and listener questions about just about anything, I guess including sports. Please send in your questions to thinktwice@jns.org, and I'll get to as many as I can. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon.